Apache woman saved by a cowboy, a Wild West survival story. The sun hung high over the endless desert like a burning fire in the sky. The land stretched far in every direction, full of red rocks, dry sand, and lonely winds that carried dust across the open plains. There were no tall trees, no soft green fields, only hard ground that seemed to breathe heat. In this vast and dangerous Wild West, survival depended on strength, patience, and courage. In the middle of this rough land walked an Apache woman. She was young, but her face showed the wisdom of someone who had already faced many hardships. Her long black hair flowed down her back, tied simply with a leather strap. She wore traditional clothing made from soft deerskin, decorated with small beads that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. On her feet were worn leather boots that had traveled many miles. Her name was not spoken in this part of the story, but her spirit was clear. She was strong, proud, and deeply connected to the land. She moved with careful steps, always aware of her surroundings. Her dark eyes scanned the horizon constantly, watching for danger, food, or shelter. The desert was beautiful in its own way, but it was also unforgiving. She had been separated from her people 2 days ago. A sudden sandstorm had swept across the plain, splitting her group apart. The powerful winds had blinded everyone, forcing them to scatter in different directions. When the storm finally faded, she found herself alone, far from her tribe, with no clear path back home. Since then, she had been walking without rest. Her throat felt dry, her lips cracked, and her stomach ached from hunger. She carried a small leather pouch with a little dried meat and a nearly empty water skin. Every step felt heavier than the last, yet she refused to stop. She knew that standing still in this land could mean death. The desert around her was silent, except for the occasional howl of a distant coyote or the flutter of a lonely bird above. The ground beneath her feet was hot, almost too hot to touch. Small lizards darted across rocks, disappearing into tiny cracks. In the distance, jagged mountains rose like giant stone walls against the sky. She remembered stories told by her elders about travelers who never returned from such lands. Some were lost to thirst, others to wild animals, and some to men who roamed the West with cruel hearts. Those memories made her cautious, but they also filled her with determination. She would not become another lost soul in the desert. As she walked, her mind drifted to her people. She pictured her mother sitting by the fire, grinding corn, her father teaching young boys how to track animals, and children laughing as they chased each other around their camp. That image gave her strength, even when her body begged her to rest. The wind picked up slightly, blowing warm air across her face. She raised her hand to shield her eyes from the bright sun. Far ahead, she noticed a faint line of dust moving across the horizon. At first, she thought it might be another storm, but it moved differently. It was too low, too steady. Her heart began to beat faster. She crouched behind a large rock, pressing her body close to the ground. Slowly, she peered over the edge. In the distance, she saw a lone figure riding a horse. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat and sat tall in the saddle. His horse kicked up small clouds of dust as it moved across the dry land. The Apache woman remained still, watching carefully. She did not know if this stranger was friend or enemy. In her experience, outsiders were unpredictable. Some treated her people with respect, but many did not. She had seen enough pain caused by outsiders to know that caution was necessary. The cowboy, unaware that he was being watched, continued his journey. He was traveling across the desert in search of water and a place to rest. His horse, a strong brown stallion, carried him steadily despite the harsh conditions. The cowboy wore faded leather boots, dusty trousers, and a worn jacket that had seen many tough days. He had been riding since early morning, guided only by the position of the sun and his instincts. His canteen was nearly empty, and his throat felt just as dry as the land beneath him. Still, he pushed forward, knowing that stopping in the open desert could be dangerous. As he rode, he noticed something unusual. Small footprints in the sand caught his attention. They were light, careful, and clearly not made by an animal. He slowed his horse and leaned forward, studying the tracks closely. His eyes narrowed with curiosity. He followed the footprints for a short distance, until he spotted the Apache woman crouched behind a rock. At first, he saw only a shadow, but then he noticed her figure. He immediately stopped his horse and raised one hand slowly to show he meant no harm. The Apache woman saw him too. She tightened her grip on a small knife at her side, ready to defend herself if needed. Her body was tense, like a wild animal prepared to run or fight. She studied him carefully, searching for any sign of danger. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. The wind blew gently between them, carrying dust and silence. Neither moved. The cowboy's face was calm, but his eyes showed concern rather than threat. He could see that she was exhausted, her steps shaky, her skin burned by the sun. Slowly, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out his water canteen. He held it up in the air, then placed it carefully on the ground between them. He stepped back a few paces to give her space. He did not speak, knowing that words might only scare her. The Apache woman watched every movement. Her instincts told her to be careful, but her thirst was overwhelming. Her throat burned like fire, and her body felt weak. After a few seconds, she slowly stood and stepped toward the canteen, keeping her eyes locked on him. She knelt down and picked it up, hesitating for a brief moment before bringing it to her lips. The cool water felt like life flowing back into her body. She drank slowly at first, then more deeply, feeling strength return to her limbs. When she finished, she wiped her mouth and placed the canteen back on the ground. The cowboy nodded slightly, relieved that she had accepted his help. He could tell she had been traveling alone for too long.
He kept his distance, not wanting to make her feel trapped or threatened. In this harsh land, trust was fragile, and he knew it had to be earned. Even with the water, the Apache woman remained cautious. She stepped back toward the rock, creating space between them again. Her eyes never left him, watching for any sudden movement. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to see what would happen next. The sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert. The air grew slightly cooler, though still warm. The cowboy looked around, aware that night would soon bring new dangers. Wild animals, outlaws, and the cold desert wind could make survival even harder. He pointed toward the west, where a faint outline of mountains could be seen. Then he pointed at himself, and finally at her, making slow, clear gestures. He was trying to show that they should travel together toward safety. His movements were gentle, non-threatening. The Apache woman understood his meaning, though she did not fully trust him. She looked toward the distant mountains, then back at him. Her mind weighed the risk. Staying alone meant almost certain danger, but following a stranger was also uncertain.
As she stood there, the ground trembled slightly in the distance. A low rumble echoed across the plains.
Both of them turned their heads at the same time. Far away, a small cloud of dust was rising.
It was too steady to be wind. Something, or someone, was approaching.
The cowboy's face grew serious. He placed his hand near his saddle, ready to act if needed. The Apache woman tightened her grip on her knife again, her body alert. The peaceful moment between them faded, replaced by tension. The desert that had seemed silent now felt alive with hidden threats. Every shadow looked darker, every sound louder. The Apache woman realized that her journey was far from over. She had survived the storm and the loneliness, but the true test of her strength was only beginning. As the dust cloud in the distance grew slowly larger, she took a deep breath, standing tall despite her exhaustion. The Wild West was cruel, unpredictable, and unforgiving, but she was still here. And for now, she was not completely alone. The sun dipped closer to the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The cowboy adjusted his hat and watched the approaching dust carefully. The Apache woman stood beside the rock, ready for whatever came next.
In that moment, two strangers in a vast, dangerous land were connected by fate, survival, and the will to keep going. The dust cloud in the distance grew slowly larger, rolling across the flat desert like a moving storm.
The air felt heavy, and even the wind seemed to pause. The Apache woman and the cowboy stood still, their eyes fixed on the approaching shape. The quiet that followed was filled with tension, like the calm before a sudden thunder. The cowboy placed his hand carefully on his saddle, not to threaten, but to stay ready. His horse shifted slightly beneath him, sensing his unease. The animal snorted softly, pawing at the dry ground. The Apache woman stayed close to the large rock, her body tense, every muscle prepared to react. As the dust moved closer, faint shapes began to appear inside it. At first they were just shadows, but soon the outlines of horses and riders became clear. There were 3 men riding together, moving at a steady pace across the desert. Their figures were rough, their hats pulled low, and their posture confident in a way that made the air feel unsafe. The Apache woman's heart began to beat faster. She had seen men like this before. Travelers who cared little for others, who took what they wanted and left pain behind. She tightened her grip on her small knife, though she knew it might not be enough if trouble came. The cowboy watched them carefully, studying their movements. He had lived long enough in the Wild West to recognize danger when he saw it.
These men did not ride like honest ranchers or peaceful travelers. Their eyes scanned the land too sharply, their pace too controlled, as if they were searching for something, or someone.
One of the riders raised his hand and pointed toward the rock where the Apache woman stood. The others turned their heads in that direction. Their horses slowed, and the dust behind them settled slightly. A thin, uneasy silence spread across the desert once again. The Apache woman felt a chill run through her despite the heat. She knew she had been noticed. Slowly, she stepped back behind the rock, making herself smaller, trying to disappear into the shadows. Her breathing became shallow but steady. She would not show fear, even if her body trembled inside. The cowboy gently moved his horse forward a few steps, placing himself slightly between her and the approaching riders. His face remained calm, but his eyes were sharp. He did not want trouble, but he would not turn away from it either.
One of the men, the tallest of the 3, rode ahead of the others.
He had a thick beard, sunburned skin, and a crooked smile that did not reach his eyes. His horse was strong and dark, its muscles visible beneath its dusty coat. He stopped a short distance away and tipped his hat slightly, though his tone carried no real respect.
"Well now,"
he called out, his voice rough and loud in the open air.
"What do we have here? A lonely cowboy and something else hiding behind that rock."
The other 2 men laughed softly, their eyes fixed on the Apache woman's hiding place. Their laughter echoed across the empty land, making the moment feel even more dangerous. The cowboy straightened in his saddle.
"This land is big enough for all of us," he said calmly. "No need to cause trouble."
The bearded man's smile widened.
"Trouble," he repeated slowly. "We're just passing through."
But a man gets curious when he sees something unusual out here. His eyes flicked toward the rock again, clearly aware that the Apache woman was there. The Apache woman stayed silent, her body pressed against the cool stone. She could feel the rough surface against her back, grounding her. Her mind raced as she listened to every word, every shift in tone. The cowboy glanced briefly toward her, then back at the men.
"There's nothing here for you,"
he said firmly.
"Move along."
For a moment, the 3 riders exchanged looks. The bearded man stroked his chin thoughtfully, his gaze never leaving the cowboy.
"You seem awful protective for someone who just met her,"
he said with a hint of mockery.
"Makes a man wonder what's really going on."
The cowboy's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his voice steady.
"It's simple.
"A person in need deserves help, that's all." One of the other men leaned forward in his saddle. "Help?" he scoffed. "Out here, you help yourself first. That's how you survive."
The Apache woman listened closely, her heart pounding. She could sense that these men were testing the cowboy, looking for weakness. In the desert, even small moments could turn into life-or-death situations. The bearded man slowly guided his horse a few steps closer. The cowboy did not move back, but his hand rested firmly near his saddle. His horse shifted again, sensing the rising tension.
"Why don't you let us take a look?"
the bearded man said casually.
"Just to make sure everything's fine."
Before the cowboy could respond, the Apache woman stepped out slightly from behind the rock. Her posture was straight, her chin lifted, her eyes filled with quiet strength. She did not speak, but her presence alone sent a clear message. She was not afraid to be seen. The 3 men's eyes immediately focused on her. One of them let out a low whistle, clearly impressed. The bearded man's expression changed from teasing to something colder. "Well now," he muttered,
That changes things. The cowboy quickly turned his head toward her, surprised but relieved that she stood tall instead of hiding.
He gave her a small, reassuring nod, hoping she understood that he would not let harm come to her. The Apache woman met his gaze for a brief second. In that moment, something passed between them. A silent understanding, fragile but real. The bearded man shifted in his saddle, his tone growing less friendly.
"A woman alone out here is dangerous business," he said. "For her and for anyone around her." The cowboy's voice grew firmer.
"She is not alone anymore." The wind picked up slightly, carrying dust across the ground. The desert seemed to stretch even wider around them, making the small group of people feel tiny in its vastness. One of the other riders whispered something to the bearded man, his eyes still locked on the Apache woman. The bearded man nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. For a tense moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the soft breathing of the horses and the distant cry of a bird. Then, without warning, the bearded man laughed, loud, harsh, and unsettling.
"All right, cowboy," he said, raising both hands slightly. "No need to get all serious.
We'll move along." He turned his horse around, signaling to the others. The two men followed, though one of them shot a final, lingering look toward the Apache woman. As they rode away, the dust behind them rose once more, slowly swallowing their figures until there were nothing but faint shapes on the horizon. The cowboy released a slow breath he had been holding. He did not relax completely, but his shoulders lowered slightly. He turned toward the Apache woman. "They're gone," he said gently, keeping his voice calm. She nodded once, still watching the distance. Her body remained alert, but some of the tension eased from her stance. The sun continued its slow descent, painting the sky with warm colors. The danger had passed for now, but both of them knew the desert was full of unseen threats. The cowboy climbed down from his horse and approached the water canteen again. He picked it up and refilled it from his larger supply, then set it down near her feet without stepping too close. She looked at it, then at him. This time she did not hesitate as much. She knelt and took another careful drink, feeling her strength return bit by bit. After a moment she placed the canteen down and stood again. The cowboy noticed how tired she still looked, her movements slower, her face marked by exhaustion. He pointed toward the west once more, toward the distant mountains now glowing faintly in the fading light. Then he pointed at himself, then at her, repeating his earlier gesture. She studied him quietly. Her mind weighed the events of the past few moments. He had stood between her and danger without hesitation. He had not treated her as an object, a burden, or a target. That meant something. Still, trust did not come easily. Her people had suffered too much at the hands of strangers for her to give it freely. The cowboy did not rush her. He simply waited, standing beside his horse, letting her decide. The wind shifted again, bringing a cooler breeze across the land. The first stars began to appear in the deepening sky, tiny points of light against the vast darkness above. In the distance, another faint howl echoed, a reminder that the desert would soon belong to the night. The Apache woman finally looked back at the mountains. She knew that staying in this open land after dark would be dangerous. She also knew that traveling alone in her weakened state could be fatal. Slowly, she took a small step forward. The cowboy's face softened with quiet relief. He did not smile broadly, but there was gratitude in his eyes. He climbed back onto his horse and held out his hand, not to pull her up, but to offer support. She hesitated briefly, then placed her hand lightly against his forearm as she stepped closer to the horse. He guided her carefully to walk beside him rather than ride, understanding that she might not feel comfortable sitting behind him. He respected that without question. Together they began to move toward the distant mountains, their shadows stretching long across the desert sand. Behind them, the rock where she had hidden stood silent, a witness to a moment that could have ended in fear but instead became the first fragile step toward trust. Ahead of them, the night waited, full of unknown challenges, hidden dangers, and difficult paths. But for the first time since the storm, the Apache woman was not completely alone. And for the first time in many miles, the cowboy felt that his journey had gained a deeper purpose than simply surviving the Wild West. The desert around them grew darker as they walked, but their footsteps carried a quiet promise that even in the harshest land, two strangers could find a way to move forward together. The night settled slowly over the desert, spreading a deep blue shade across the sky.
The last glow of the sun faded behind the distant mountains, leaving the land wrapped in silence. The Apache woman walked beside the cowboy's horse, her steps steady but tired.
The cowboy rode slowly, keeping his pace gentle so she could keep up without strain. The air grew cooler, but the desert still felt vast and unpredictable. Small rocks crunched beneath their feet, and the wind carried faint sounds from far away. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called out, its lonely cry echoing across the plains. The Apache woman stiffened slightly, but she did not stop. The cowboy noticed her reaction and placed his hand lightly on his horse's neck to calm it. He glanced down at her with quiet concern. She met his eyes for a brief moment, then looked ahead again.
Neither spoke, yet they both understood that the night could bring danger. They traveled for some time toward the mountains. The outline of the rocky peaks grew clearer as they moved closer. Shadows stretched across the ground, shifting with every step of the horse. Above them, stars began to fill the sky, sparkling like tiny fires in the darkness. After a while, the cowboy slowed his horse and pointed toward a small cluster of rocks ahead.
It looked like a natural shelter, partially hidden from view. He climbed down carefully and gestured for her to rest there.
The Apache woman studied the place before nodding. She stepped inside the rocky space, feeling the cool stone beneath her hands. The cowboy stayed outside, gathering a few dry sticks and placing them together. With practiced movements, he started a small fire, just bright enough to give light and warmth, but not too large to draw attention. The gentle glow of the flames danced across their faces.
The Apache woman sat near the edge of the shelter, keeping a careful distance but appreciating the warmth. The cowboy sat across from her, resting against his saddle. For the first time since they met, the tension between them softened slightly. He opened his saddlebag and pulled out a small piece of dried meat and some flat bread.
He held it out to her without stepping closer. She hesitated, then slowly took it. She ate quietly, feeling her strength return with each bite. The cowboy ate as well, though he kept his eyes alert, scanning the dark desert beyond the firelight. He knew that trouble often moved silently at night. After some time, the Apache woman closed her eyes, exhaustion finally taking over. Her breathing grew slow and steady. The cowboy watched over her, staying awake, listening to every sound around them. Hours passed. The fire burned low, glowing softly like a tired heartbeat. The desert remained quiet, but the cowboy's instincts told him not to relax completely. Then, in the deep stillness of the night, he heard something. A faint noise, the distant thud of hooves against hard ground. He lifted his head slowly, his body tensing. At first the sound was barely noticeable, but it grew clearer. The Apache woman stirred, sensing his unease. She opened her eyes and followed his gaze into the darkness. Far beyond the firelight, a small dust cloud began to form, even in the dim night. Dark shapes moved within it, horses and riders. The cowboy stood up quietly, stepping away from the fire so he would not be an easy target. He moved his horse behind a large rock and tied it loosely, keeping it calm. The Apache woman rose as well, her body alert. She moved silently toward another shadowed area, her instincts guiding her like second nature. Her hand rested near her knife, ready if needed. The riders grew closer. 3 men, the same ones from earlier in the day.
Their faces were harder now, their expressions less playful and more determined. They slowed their horses as they approached the faint glow of the dying fire.
The bearded man dismounted first, his boots crunching against the gravel. He glanced around carefully, his eyes scanning every shadow.
"Well, well," he muttered. "Looks like our cowboy friend made himself comfortable." One of the other men kicked the remains of the fire lightly with his boot, sending small sparks into the air.
"They were here," he said.
The bearded man smirked.
"They didn't get far." The Apache woman watched from behind her rock, her breathing slow and controlled.
She could feel her heart pounding, but she refused to let fear take over. The cowboy stepped forward from the shadows, his posture calm but firm. "You're back," he said evenly. The bearded man turned toward him, his smile sharp. "Told you we were just passing through, didn't we?" he replied.
"Funny how paths keep crossing."
The cowboy stood tall. "You can pass through again."
"There's nothing for you here."
The bearded man laughed softly, but there was no humor in it.
"A man doesn't ride all this way for nothing."
His eyes flicked toward the rocks where the Apache woman was hiding, clearly aware of her presence. The tension in the air grew thick, like a storm waiting to break.
The desert, usually so quiet, seemed to hold its breath. One of the other men stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his saddle.
"Why don't you step aside, cowboy?" he said. "No need to make this harder than it has to be."
The cowboy did not move. His gaze remained steady, his voice low but strong.
"She's under my protection."
The bearded man's expression darkened.
"Protection?"
he sneered.
"Out here, that word doesn't mean much."
The Apache woman shifted slightly, ready to act if things turned dangerous. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Suddenly, one of the men moved quickly toward the rock where she stood. He clearly intended to force her out. Before he could reach her, the cowboy stepped forward, placing himself directly in his path.
"Stop!"
he said sharply. The man hesitated, then looked back at the bearded leader. The bearded man nodded slowly, giving silent approval.
In that instant, the situation changed.
The cowboy moved with surprising speed, grabbing the man's arm and pulling him back before he could react. His actions were firm but controlled, meant to protect, not to harm. The other two men tensed immediately, stepping forward. The Apache woman stepped out from behind the rock, standing tall beside the cowboy. Her presence alone made them pause. For a brief moment, no one moved. The firelight flickered across their faces, casting sharp shadows that made the scene feel even more intense. The bearded man narrowed his eyes.
"You're outnumbered,"
he said coldly. The cowboy did not back down. "Maybe, but I'm not stepping aside." The Apache woman met the bearded man's gaze, her eyes filled with quiet strength. She did not speak, but her posture sent a clear message. She would not be taken without resistance. The wind picked up slightly, carrying dust across the ground. The horses shifted nervously, sensing the tension. Then, unexpectedly, a loud howl echoed across the desert, much closer than before. Another followed. Then another. The sound of wild animals in the night made the riders hesitate. One of the men looked around uneasily.
"Coyotes!"
he muttered. The bearded man glanced into the darkness, clearly aware that danger surrounded them from more than just the cowboy and the Apache woman. For a moment, his confidence wavered. The cowboy seized the opportunity. He raised his voice just enough to carry across the night.
"You came looking for trouble. You found enough. Leave!"
The bearded man studied him carefully, then looked at the Apache woman. His eyes flicked toward the dark desert where the howls continued. Slowly he stepped back. "Fine," he said finally.
"You win this one, cowboy." He turned toward his horse and climbed back into the saddle. The other two men followed without question. As they rode away, their figures disappeared once again into the night, swallowed by darkness and dust. The Apache woman released a quiet breath she had been holding. Her body relaxed slightly, though she remained alert. The cowboy stood still for a moment, watching until the riders were completely gone. Only then did he lower his guard. He turned toward her, his expression softer now.
"They won't be back tonight,"
he said gently. She nodded, understanding his meaning even without words. He moved back to the small fire and added a few more sticks, bringing the flames back to life. The warm light returned, pushing back the cold darkness. The Apache woman stepped closer this time, sitting near the fire. The cowboy kept a respectful distance, giving her space. For a while they sat in silence, listening to the crackle of the flames and the quiet breathing of the desert around them. The danger had passed, but its weight still lingered in the air. The Apache woman glanced at him, her eyes no longer filled with complete distrust. She had seen him stand between her and harm, not once, but twice. That kind of courage did not come from selfish motives. The cowboy noticed her gaze and gave a small nod, acknowledging the moment without speaking too much. Slowly, the night grew deeper. The stars shone brightly above, scattered like diamonds across the sky. The howls in the distance faded, replaced by the calm of midnight. Eventually, the Apache woman leaned back against the rock, exhaustion once again taking over. This time, she slept more peacefully, knowing that someone was watching over her. The cowboy stayed awake a while longer, his eyes scanning the darkness. He thought about the day, the storm, the meeting, the confrontation. His journey had changed in ways he never expected. He looked at her resting form, then back at the fire. In the harsh Wild West, where life was often cruel and lonely, he had found a purpose beyond his own survival. As the fire slowly burned down again, he finally closed his eyes, allowing himself a few moments of rest. The desert remained vast and dangerous, but for now, in this small circle of light, two strangers had survived the night together. And as dawn quietly approached on the far horizon, their story moved one step closer to something neither of them fully understood yet. Trust, survival, and a fragile bond formed in the wildest land. The first light of dawn slowly spread across the desert, painting the sky with soft shades of pink and gold. The night shadows faded, revealing the wide land once again. The small fire had burned down to glowing embers, giving off a gentle warmth. The Apache woman stirred, feeling the cool morning air on her skin. She opened her eyes slowly and sat up, taking in her surroundings. For a moment she forgot where she was, but then the memory of the night returned. She glanced toward the cowboy and saw him still sitting near the embers, awake, alert, and watching the horizon. His hat was pulled low, and his face looked tired but steady. His horse stood quietly nearby, grazing on a few tough desert plants that had somehow grown between the rocks. The Apache woman straightened her posture and stretched her stiff limbs.
Her body still felt weak, but stronger than the day before.
The water and food from the night had helped more than she expected. The cowboy noticed her movement and turned his head. When he saw that she was awake, he gave a small, respectful nod. He did not speak right away, giving her space to wake fully. She nodded back, this time with less hesitation. Something between them had shifted.
Fear was still there, but it was no longer as sharp. Curiosity and cautious trust had begun to take its place.
The cowboy stood up slowly and walked toward his saddlebag. He took out his water canteen and filled it from his main supply. Then he placed it gently on a flat rock near her, along with a small piece of dried meat. She looked at the items, then at him. He simply pointed to them and stepped back, showing that she was free to take them. She picked up the canteen and drank carefully, feeling the cool water travel down her throat. Then she took the meat and ate slowly, her eyes never fully leaving him. As the sun rose higher, the desert came alive with sound.
Birds flew across the sky, small creatures moved between rocks, and the wind carried soft whispers across the land. The harsh beauty of the Wild West stretched endlessly in every direction.
After eating, the Apache woman stood and walked a few steps away, scanning the horizon. She looked toward the distant mountains again, their shapes clearer in the daylight. Somewhere beyond them were her people, her home, her life. The cowboy followed her gaze. He understood without words what she was thinking. He stepped closer, but not too close, and pointed toward the mountains. Then he pointed at himself, and then at her. She watched his gesture carefully. This time she did not pull away. Instead, she slowly nodded. A quiet understanding passed between them. They would travel together. They packed what little they had. The cowboy secured his saddle, checked his supplies, and gently led his horse toward the open land. The Apache woman walked beside him, her steps more steady than before. As they began their journey, the desert stretched wide and bright under the rising sun. The ground was uneven, filled with rocks, sand, and hidden dips. The heat slowly grew stronger, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. They moved at a slow, steady pace. The cowboy watched their surroundings carefully, always scanning for danger. The Apache woman walked with grace and awareness, her eyes reading the land like an open book. After some time, they reached a narrow canyon.
Tall walls of red rock rose on both sides, creating a shaded path through the desert. The air felt cooler inside, and the sound of their footsteps echoed softly.
As they entered the canyon, the Apache woman suddenly stopped. Her body tensed, and her eyes narrowed. The cowboy noticed immediately. He placed his hand on his horse's neck and looked around cautiously.
She pointed toward the ground where faint tracks were visible in the dust. They were fresh, made within the last day.
More riders had passed through here. The cowboy crouched down and studied the tracks. His expression grew serious.
They were not from peaceful travelers. These were the same men from the night before. He straightened slowly and looked at her.
She met his gaze, her face calm but alert. Without speaking, they both understood that danger might be nearby. They continued through the canyon, but with even more caution. The Apache woman stayed close to the rock walls, moving silently, while the cowboy kept his horse steady and ready.
As they reached the middle of the canyon, they heard voices echoing faintly ahead. The sound bounced off the tall walls, making it hard to tell exactly where it came from.
The cowboy signaled for silence and tied his horse loosely to a nearby rock. The Apache woman moved ahead carefully, using her natural knowledge of the land to stay hidden. Peeking around a large boulder, they saw the three men from before resting near a small stream that cut through the canyon. Their horses stood nearby, drinking water. The bearded man laughed loudly, breaking the stillness of the place. The other two sat on rocks, cleaning their weapons casually. The Apache woman's eyes hardened. The cowboy placed a hand on her arm gently, stopping her from moving forward. He shook his head slightly, signaling that they should not engage. She understood, but her body remained tense. She did not like knowing these men were so close.
The cowboy slowly guided her back, moving quietly so they would not be seen.
Once they were far enough away, they continued along a different path that led around the canyon instead of through it. The sun climbed higher in the sky, making the desert feel even hotter. Sweat formed on their skin, and their breaths grew heavier. At one point, the Apache woman stumbled slightly on a loose rock. The cowboy quickly reached out to steady her, his hand firm but gentle. She looked at him in surprise, then nodded her thanks. They paused for a moment in a small patch of shade. The cowboy offered her water again, and this time she accepted without hesitation. She drank slowly, then handed it back. As they rested, she looked around at the land with a thoughtful expression.
This desert was dangerous, but it was also familiar in many ways. She could sense the life hidden beneath its harsh surface.
The cowboy watched her quietly. He admired her strength, her calmness, and her connection to the land.
In the Wild West, where most people only saw struggle, she saw meaning. After a short rest, they continued their journey.
The path grew rougher, with sharp rocks and steep slopes. The Apache woman moved with natural ease, while the cowboy carefully guided his horse. As they climbed a small ridge, a strong gust of wind swept across them, carrying sand and dust. The Apache woman raised her arm to shield her face. The cowboy turned his back slightly to block some of the wind. When the gust passed, they found themselves standing at a high point overlooking the desert. Below them, the land stretched endlessly, shimmering in the heat. In the distance, the mountains stood tall, their peaks glowing in the sunlight. The Apache woman's eyes softened as she looked towards them. She felt a pull in her heart, a deep desire to return to her people. The cowboy stepped beside her and followed her gaze. He could sense how much this meant to her. Without speaking, he pointed again toward the mountains, then placed his hand over his heart, then pointed to her. She looked at him, surprised by the gesture. For a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. Respect, understanding, and a quiet bond formed through shared danger. She slowly placed her own hand over her heart and gave a small nod. They stood there together for a moment, two people from very different worlds connected by fate and survival. As they began to descend the ridge, the Apache woman felt something new growing inside her. Not just trust, but a sense of safety she had not felt since the storm separated her from her people. The cowboy, too, felt changed. His journey through the Wild West had always been lonely, but now he walked with purpose beyond himself. They traveled until the sun began to dip again toward the horizon. The desert slowly shifted from bright gold to deep orange, casting long shadows behind them. They found another small shelter among rocks as evening approached. The cowboy built a small fire once more, careful to keep it low and hidden. The Apache woman gathered a few dry plants nearby, helping without being asked. This time, when they sat near the fire, the space between them felt smaller. Not crowded, but more comfortable. They ate quietly, sharing the last of their food. The Apache woman watched the flames dance, her mind filled with thoughts of home, danger, and the strange path that had brought her here. The cowboy leaned back against his saddle, keeping one eye on the darkness beyond the firelight. He felt responsible for her now, in a way he had not expected. As the night settled in, the Apache woman slowly closed her eyes.
This time she did not lie far away. She rested closer to the fire, trusting that the cowboy would watch over her.
He noticed, and a quiet sense of pride and responsibility filled him. Above them, the stars shimmered brightly, scattered across the vast sky. The desert breathed softly around them, its dangers still present but less threatening within their small circle of light. In this harsh land, two strangers had become something more than travelers passing by. They had become companions in survival, and as the fire slowly burned down and the night grew deeper, both of them knew that their journey was far from over. But together, they felt stronger than before. The Wild West still stretched endlessly around them, full of unknown paths, hidden threats, and difficult choices. Jake and Nita rode through the dark night, the sound of their horses' hooves the only noise that cut through the stillness of the desert. The cool night air was a relief after the harsh heat of the day, but it carried with it a sense of urgency. They had narrowly escaped the Apache warriors who had been tracking Nita, and now they had to keep moving. There was no time to rest. There was no time to look back. For Nita, the escape had been both a victory and a heavy burden. She was free from the warriors, but now she was a woman without a home. The desert stretched endlessly before her, a vast emptiness where the world seemed to disappear into the horizon. But in that emptiness, she felt something stir within her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. A flicker of hope. Jake, too, felt the weight of their journey. He had lived most of his life alone, out in the wild, working the land and avoiding the dangers of society. He had never thought much about relationships or companionship, but now, with Nita beside him, he found himself thinking differently. There was something about her strength, her resilience, that drew him in. She wasn't just a woman he had saved from the desert. She had become someone he cared about, someone he wanted to protect. The two of them had built a bond over the past few days, a bond forged not in words but in actions. They hadn't talked much, but there had been moments, small moments, when their eyes met, and in those moments they both understood what the other was feeling. It wasn't just the shared survival, the struggle against the harsh desert. It was something deeper. It was trust. As they rode, Jake couldn't help but glance over at Nita. She looked different now, her face no longer as pale as it had been when he first found her in the desert. She was strong, more alert, but there was something in her eyes, something that told Jake she wasn't completely free. She had been through too much. The weight of her past still clung to her, even as she sat tall in the saddle, her posture straight, as if she were trying to keep the world at arm's length. They rode on in silence, the night stretching out before them. Nita kept her gaze forward, but her mind wandered back to the moment she had decided to leave her people. It hadn't been an easy choice. She had loved her people deeply, and though she had been raised to be strong, to never show weakness, there had always been a part of her that longed for something more. Her escape had been an act of survival, but it was also an act of rebellion. She had chosen to live for herself, not just for the survival of her tribe. Now, as she rode beside Jake, she was torn. Her heart felt heavy with guilt. She had run from her people, and she had run from the traditions that had shaped her life. She didn't know where she belonged anymore. She couldn't go back. Not now. And yet, there was a part of her that longed for the comfort of the life she had left behind. Jake noticed the way Nita's gaze seemed distant, lost in her thoughts. He understood. He had his own struggles, his own past that haunted him. There were times when he felt the same way, unsure of where his life was headed. But with Nita, it was different. He found himself wanting to offer her more than just survival. He wanted to offer her a future where she didn't have to constantly look over her shoulder, a future where they could both find peace, away from the violence and chaos of the world they lived in. They rode through the night, not stopping until the first light of dawn began to paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. The land was beginning to come alive, the sounds of the desert shifting as the new day began. They stopped for a moment, letting the horses rest, and drank from a small creek they had stumbled upon. Jake tied the horses to a nearby tree and sat down on a rock, watching Nita as she knelt by the water. Nita took a long drink, the cool water refreshing her after the long ride. As she stood, she glanced over at Jake, who was watching her intently. She could see the concern in his eyes, but there was something else there, something she hadn't expected. He wasn't just concerned for her safety. He cared about her. The realization hit her suddenly. She had been so focused on survival that she hadn't let herself think about the bond they had formed. Jake had saved her life, but it wasn't just a simple act of kindness. He had given her something more. He had given her the chance to start over, to build something new. It was more than she had ever hoped for, and it was more than she felt she deserved. As the sun rose higher, casting its golden light over the desert, Nita and Jake sat together, silently watching the day unfold. The land stretched out before them, wide and open, full of possibilities. Nita felt a shift inside her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel trapped. She didn't feel alone. She felt the warmth of the sun on her face, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that she could have a future beyond the desert, beyond the past that had followed her all her life. Jake stood up and walked over to where Nita was sitting. He didn't say anything at first, but she could see the sincerity in his eyes. He reached out and offered her his hand, and without a word, Nita took it. There was no need for more words. The connection between them was enough. They both knew that their journey was far from over. The dangers they faced would not disappear just because they had made it through one night. But in that moment, they didn't need to worry about the future. They didn't need to think about the battles that lay ahead. They had made it this far together, and that was enough. As they mounted their horses once more, Nita looked over at Jake, a sense of peace settling over her. The road ahead was uncertain, and she didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, she felt like she had something to fight for. She had something worth living for. A future with someone who cared for her, someone who had shown her kindness when it seemed impossible. They rode off together, side by side, into the rising sun. The Wild West was a dangerous place, but it was also a place full of second chances. And for Nita and Jake, their second chance had just begun.